I'm Catherine Sear, the exhibition coordinator at Maine Maritime Museum, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Bob Steneck, marine ecologist, conservation biologist, and professor at the University of Maine's School of Marine Sciences. Throughout his career, Bob has studied the structure and function of coastal marine ecosystems at his laboratories in the Gulf of Maine, Alaska's Aleutian Islands, Norway, and throughout the tropical Caribbean and Indo-Pacific Oceans. His studies examine the organisms vital to these ecosystems and the people who depend on them. By applying ecology to human marine resource and management, his studies have been enormously useful for the people who make their living from the sea. His current focus includes Caribbean coral reefs and the lobsters, sea urchins, and kelp forests of the Gulf of Maine. Bob will be delivering an in-person lecture at Maine Maritime Museum on Thursday, February 23rd at 6 p.m. The lecture, titled Cash's Ledge, Maine's Lost World, will provide deep insight into his extensive research on Cash's Ledge in the Gulf of Maine, which, when he observed it, was as close to Maine's pristine ecosystem prior to European arrival as one could find. Head over to mainemaritimemuseum.org to register.
Greenhouse gases are warming the ocean. They're changing climate patterns. We're getting more intense hurricanes. We're getting rainfall that's coming down in much larger amounts in coastal Maine. We're seeing new species show up. I think the bottom line is our ecosystem that had been arguably stable for thousands of years conservatively now is highly dynamic. We kind of have to expect the unexpected. Well, first of all, I've always been a naturalist. Even as a child, I was a birder. My idea of fun was going in the backyard and watching antlions eat ants. And I was able to start scuba diving when I was 10 years old. So I started making the kind of observations that I found really interesting. And I learned very early on that you can walk and go great distances on land before you see interesting interactions with animals. Or you can just simply go down and sit almost any place, even in a lake or in the ocean, and activities going on right in front of you. So I found that to be a relatively easy place just to observe, to be a good naturalist. But I found the research that had been done, and now I'm talking about, the early 1970s when I was going to college. Most of the research was being done that was theoretical. There was just a beginning of interest in the kind of approach that I wanted to take. And so working underwater and observing interactions and looking at patterns of distribution and abundance, figuring out how competition, predation, and other ecological processes are driving those patterns really defined my research trajectory for my entire life. My research as a marine ecologist is to study marine organisms in the environment in which they live. And it's really the way I got started. My PhD research, which was done in a number of places, St. Croix, Washington State, and Maine, and fell in love with the state of Maine. It's a little ironic that while I love working on coral reefs, I'm actually not a big fan of being hot and sweaty all the time. And the tropics, I was most happy when I was underwater. Working in the Pacific Northwest was also enormously fun, very highly diverse marine ecosystems. But as an ecologist, every species is a variable that you need to control. Maine has uniquely low species diversity. It's not widely known that our diversity is so low, but that means we have a simplified ecosystem and one where you can control the major players, and you can do that experimentally, which is what I've done, and it gives you a clear message about what's sort of driving these ecosystems. There has been, in the last 40 years, a significant increase in the resolution of how we can study marine organisms. And by studying them in situ in a variety of ways. Most of my work is with scuba diving, but I've also used submarines, remotely operated vehicles. It gives us an insight that you can't get any other way about the distribution, abundance, and factors influencing marine ecosystems. When I was doing my PhD at Johns Hopkins, my advisor was basically saying, we study natural ecosystems, so we leave the human effects to people who do applied research, with the idea that if you did applied research, that's because you couldn't hack it with basic research. That turns out to be just dead wrong. But I saw a lot of lobsters on the seafloor, and I went to Maine's Department of Marine Resources, and I said, I'm surprised that lobsters are a very important fishery, but I'm seeing a lot of lobsters. And this fellow at DMR rocked back in his chair, and he said, well, they're actually very rare. And I said, no, wait a minute. I'm seeing them. This isn't a theoretical discussion. This is what I'm seeing. And it turns out nobody at DMR at the time was studying lobsters in their environment. They were using mostly sea sampling that was coming up from lobstermen. And they concluded that the lobster stocks were about to crash, which is what the federal scientists were saying. So I started doing research looking at what lobsters eat, who eats lobsters, and lobstermen initially started reporting me to wardens saying that I was doing some illegal activity on lobsters. Well, I didn't realize that just putting a lobster in a cage underwater is actually questionable about whether that's legal or not. So I had to get a license, and I started talking to the lobstermen, and I was saying, well, I'm working in this place, and this region, I see this is the area that has a lot of lobsters with only one claw. And they go, yeah, that's right. That's, they sometimes call that a hospital ground. And I said, but if I went across to Johns Bay and there's this one spot there where I see a good number of lobsters, and they started taking notice that unlike other scientists they had talked to, actually I knew something about the distribution of lobsters. I was learning about their sense, too. I set up an experiment out by Pemaquid Point where I had to put down a small temporary cage that I was just putting down. And when I got to the little spot where I wanted to put this, there was a lobster trap there. And I thought, okay, well, no harm done. I'm just going to move this lobster trap about 6 feet so I can put my experiment there. I came back the next day, and the lobsterman was right over our site. And I pulled up, and I said, hey, how you doing? He said, why'd you move my trap? And I go, what? He recognized that I moved the trap 6 feet? He goes, yeah. I always put this trap in that notch, and I always get a lobster every day. I didn't get my lobster today. And I realized their sense of the distribution of lobsters was much more fine-grained than I ever imagined. And some years later, when I had a submarine, the submarine had a bubble where the science was done, but there was room in the back where lobstermen could go. And so I after I'd been working on lobster boats, sea sampling, and getting to know the lobstermen, I invited them to go for a ride in a submarine. And these guys, they don't know how to swim. They think it's actually unsafe to know how to swim. That makes them better on their boat. But when they went down to the seafloor, and we were working at some depth in some places, these are all places where these guys fish. Most of them, after the dive, said, it's exactly what I expected. Because they could see the type of mud. They could see the little critters that would come up in their traps. They knew from their depth sounder exactly what the terrain looked like. So for me, I'm looking at this, and I'm seeing a landscape that they actually knew in their gut from years of fishing that area. Working with the fishing community and working on board the boats, and I did this for 10 years, I learned a lot about marine resources, about people who make their living at this on the sea. And one of the reasons why they were so encouraging of my research was because I was suggesting, from what I was seeing, that the lobster populations were not threatened. They were seeing a lot of egg-bearing lobsters, a lot of V-notch lobsters, which are protected from harvest. They were seeing a lot of baby lobsters, and they didn't understand why the federal scientists and other managers were saying the stocks were about to collapse. And I was the first person to agree with them. And then I brought my science to the fisheries managers. And ultimately, I think that the management that they had planned on doing, they didn't do. So it was one of the very first times when a fishing community and the scientific community got together and collaborated. And I found that instructive for me, but also very rewarding. One of my graduate students who worked with me, Carl Wilson, he heads up science for DMR now. He and I used to go out sea sampling, and when he started working at DMR, he expanded their sea sampling program so that we have a much better sense of what's coming up. And they've done a lot more, data that includes the settlement index, that how many babies come to the seafloor every year. That's monitored by DMR. They have ventless traps so they can look at abundance. They started an inshore trawl survey that didn't exist before. So our capacity to understand patterns is much better now than when I got started. Well, since 1985, there's been a five-fold increase in lobster abundance, but the peak was in 2016 in terms of landings, and it's been declining since. And that's concerning. Typically, when you're concerned about the status of any commercially harvested species, you want to know, are there enough mommies out there to create eggs so that, the reproductive cycle is robust? And the reproductive population of lobsters is at a record high. And so why are the landings declining? And there are a lot of theories. We've been exploring a couple because we've observed a couple of other changes on the seafloor. Lobsters 20, 30 years ago, 80% of them were in lobster shelters. Now it's about an even split between being on sediment, ledge, or shelters. So why are there fewer lobsters in shelters? I have a PhD student who's working on this problem. But might there be something going on? Ocean temperatures are warming. There are new invasive seaweeds rolling around on the seafloor and rotting, frankly. And so we started looking into whether low oxygen may be a factor. And we're still pursuing that, but there are a lot of other things going on. There's changes in the plankton in the ocean that could be affecting larval abundances. So this is very much of an interesting scientific question because we really don't yet have a handle on why lobster populations are declining. What we can say is the traditional idea of having abundant broodstock, or enough eggs out there, is not the answer, but we don't exactly know what is. The other thing I've been working on is what drives the resilience of coral reefs. You probably know that we've had massive declines in corals throughout the world. I mean, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia got very big press when it got hit by successive coral bleaching events, which resulted from acute warming. That massive hurricanes, Hurricane Maria, for example, in the Dominican Republic, wreaked havoc on the reefs. There are a lot of factors that we cannot control. We're not going to be able to control hurricane impacts. In the short term, we're not going to be able to control acute warming. So what are the factors that contribute to the recovery of coral reefs? And for that, I've been looking at the role of herbivory, keeping the seaweed mode down. It improves the conditions for baby corals. it's something that's manageable. It's manageable at a local scale, and we've got evidence that it does work at that scale. So I'm trying to work at a number of different levels to sort of change local management to improve the recovery potential of coral reefs. The seaweed will grow unless it gets cropped down. And among the groups that can crop the seaweed down the best, we have parrotfish. Parrotfish were not originally a target species in most places in the Caribbean, but after snappers and groupers got fished out, the fishing intensity on parrotfish increased, and taking the herbivores out of the system allowed seaweed to grow up, which can poison corals. It reduces the reproductive output of corals. It kills baby corals. I mean, who likes a baby killer, right? So it's a serious problem. And in places where parrotfish have been successfully protected, we see the recovery of corals improving tenfold. So, as a matter of fact, there's a reef that I've been working on for a couple of decades now in Bonaire. It's a reef system. We have 11 sites there. And it suffered a massive bleaching event in 2010, but it has recovered completely since then. And it's the only reef in the Caribbean to exhibit complete ecosystem recovery after a bleaching event. So I'd say that that's progress. They didn't actually explicitly ban the harvesting of parrotfish. What they did is, in 1971, they voluntarily stopped spearfishing on the island. And if it's only hook and line, that will get the carnivores, but the herbivores, like parrotfish, don't take a hook. So that actually allowed, there was no fish traps at the time, so parrotfish populations grew up. And in other places, what you saw was hook and line and spearfishing taking out all the carnivores, snappers, groupers, barracuda, jacks, and then parrotfish started to be harvested. And we published a paper on this from Belize showing how they fished down the food web. But when we started showing the advantages of preserving parrotfish, Belize and several other countries have banned the harvest of parrotfish. So we actually just published a paper showing that parrotfish abundances in Belize are going up, macroalgae is declining, and there's a beginning of a slight increase in coral cover. My long-term work in Bonaire is being funded by Bonaire. I did a major study on the Eastern Caribbean. People from the Dominican Republic heard about, I gave a presentation that they heard, and they wanted me to do the same kind of work in the Dominican Republic, which we are doing. And they've made management changes in the Dominican Republic based on my research. Oh, I've got a lot. I found going out to Cassius Ledge mind-boggling. Being able to dive in a kelp forest with a kelp species that I think is new to science, in a sea of fish all around you. I had a 10-foot blue shark swim right past me, which is very unusual for being in Maine. But beyond that, I've been able to do a lot of submarine research. So I was able to spend 10 days underwater going along Georges Bank, almost the entire length of Georges Bank in the United States. As part of that, at one point we were coming up and I started seeing these squid. They were actually attaching to the sphere that we were in. And I didn't know why they were doing that until I realized we were in the middle of a feeding frenzy of tuna. And speaking of tuna, diving down to 110 feet on Cassius Ledge, I can remember one time I was just adjusting my weight belt and I looked up and 4 feet away from me was a giant bluefin tuna. And to be face to face in the water with a giant bluefin tuna was amazing. It was moving so effortlessly that I couldn't see any of its fins moving. The only thing I could see moving was its eye, and it kept its eye on me. But also, I've done saturation diving in St. Croix, where we live in a habitat at 60 feet. and somebody has to stay up 24 hours a day to be touching base with the people on land. And I remember doing the graveyard shift from 3 o'clock to 6 a.m. and watching the sunrise underwater on a coral reef. It's something that I'll never forget. My very first dives on the coast of Maine were in the mid-1970s, and what I would see would be a lot of sea urchins, crabs, as I said, lobsters. So these are all what we would call mobile benthic invertebrates, and they were all out during the daytime, and I thought that was normal. I knew that it was very different to the coral reef system that I had left. As a matter of fact, I took a marine ecology course that said in the tropics we have these ecosystems dominated by fish, but when you move to the northern climates, it's dominated by invertebrates. And I said, oh, well, okay, this all makes sense. And then I started reading history and going to museums and realizing really how important codfish were to not just Maine, but, it's the first export from the New World. That a lot of the early interests of the early explorers and their reports were every place they went. There were these huge cod and haddock every place they went. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I haven't seen anything like that. As a matter of fact, I've done hundreds, actually I've done thousands of dives. And in coastal Maine, it's extremely rare to see a codfish, or certainly nothing big. And then I got interested in some archaeological work that was done at the Turner Farm in North Haven in Penobscot Bay. It's the most extensively surveyed Indian site that goes back almost 5,000 years. And they documented every piece of fish and mollusk and animal that they found in the middens, and they carbon-14 dated it, going right up to about 500 years ago, which they call the European zone. And what struck me was by far the largest bone fragments were codfish bones, and that was really interesting. Then I collaborated with some colleagues at Bates who do isotope work, and they were able to determine with carbon and nitrogen isotopes that the vast majority of these cod were living in coastal zones, because they can tell when the carbon is being fixed by seaweed as opposed to plankton, it gives a different signature. That's interesting. And then there was some human collagen that was also tested, and it turns out that showed that they were primarily feeding on these fish. Well, this is really interesting. As a matter of fact, people used to think deer and bear was the primary food for these coastal people when they would move inland, but that's not the case. They were subsisting on fish. And I could tell right away in coastal Maine that there's no way anybody could subsist on fish with what I'm seeing. So there was this program called the National Undersea Research Program. It has since gone extinct, which is too bad. But what it did is it said, we're going to try to allow people to get into submarines and go to places where they couldn't otherwise scuba dive. And I started going out to Cassius Ledge, and the very first thing I noticed when I got out there is the sea of fish that I was seeing. Cod, pollock, wolffish, cunner, cusk. It was a fish-dominated system. And more than that, all of the species of invertebrates that I was seeing as abundant on the coast of Maine, the lobsters, sea urchins, and crabs, were rare out there. So, you could come up with a couple of ideas about why they're rare, but I thought it's because they're being eaten. And especially because I just came from a tropical ecosystem that I understood pretty well, and I knew how important fish predators are. If you go to most coral reefs, you don't see lobsters, crabs out. The only place where you see sea urchins are where they've been fished out. So I already had this in my mind. So I started setting up some experiments where we would tether lobsters and crabs. We would tether sea urchins. And what we found was, yes, they get eaten. As a matter of fact, tethering lobsters, by and large, all of them got eaten within about 24 hours. About 75% got eaten within the first 24 hours of tethering them. So there's no way they would be out walking around. And that's when it started clicking that this ecosystem is what used to be common on the coast of Maine. As a matter of fact, when I started broadening this, started looking at Canadian work, started looking at Iceland and Norway, I realized the entire North Atlantic was a fish-dominated system in its pristine state. And what I saw when I came in the mid-1970s was far from pristine. It was one that had been where the predators have already been removed. It's shockingly different, virtually every place. But the two systems that I know best, coral reefs and the Gulf of Maine. Coral reefs had extremely high coral cover. The ideas were that these were highly diverse, highly stable systems. There's one paper that said the only thing that would disrupt this kind of coral dominance would be the next ice age. They were dead wrong. We had a combination of diseases and outbreaks of sea urchins that ended up causing coral reefs to collapse throughout the Caribbean. Since then, climate change has created massive bleaching events, so that coral that at one time could be 80% cover dropped down in some places down to 1 or 2% cover. When I came to Maine, I saw a sea of sea urchins, which at the time, as I said, I thought that was natural. I now know that wasn't natural. But what we saw was this abundance of sea urchins, abundance of lobsters. Lobsters, for a variety of reasons, is relatively sustainable by the way we harvest them. You know, inefficient traps, we can't trawl for them, you can't scuba dive for them. They've been very stable. But sea urchins, this abundance of sea urchins did not go unnoticed by the fishing interest from Japan. Japan started fishing for sea urchins right after World War II. By the 1970s, most of the Pacific Rim had been overfished by Japanese harvesters, or at least hiring local people to harvest for a Japanese market. That market got to Maine in 1987. And there were distributors. There were 1,500 full-time sea urchin fishermen. It was the second most valuable species harvested in Maine. It peaked in 1993 and then it collapsed. And the collapse was shocking. By removing enough sea urchins that had been the major grazer, it allowed kelp to grow up. And the interesting complications that relate to kelp that first grew up and then the other seaweed that came in fostered crab growth. Crabs, the baby crabs actually eat baby sea urchins, but the adult crabs eat adult sea urchins. And so really in the last 20 years, we've had almost no sea urchins on the coast of Maine. To go from carpets of sea urchins to none is not something I ever expected. Going from what we would call a barrens to kelp forest is not something I would have expected. So in our ocean systems are changing at remarkable rates. And most people don't see them because these are underwater and out of sight. You look out over the ocean on a nice blue sky day and you see blue water, you think, gosh, this is a system that probably hasn't changed at all. And yet, its change is so profound, it would be the equivalent of taking the North Woods and clear-cutting it in terms of the magnitude of change that's gone on. It's just that most people don't see that. These are highly dynamic, and they're dynamic for a number of reasons. You know, I talked about what you can do in terms of management locally on coral reefs, and the same management could be going on in coastal Maine. But the bigger issue that's taking center stage globally is climate change. Greenhouse gases are warming the ocean. They're changing climate patterns. We're getting more intense hurricanes. We're getting rainfall that's coming down in much larger amounts in coastal Maine. We're seeing new species show up. I think the bottom line is our ecosystem that had been arguably stable for thousands of years conservatively now is highly dynamic. We kind of have to expect the unexpected. We've seen black sea bass and red hake and even blue crabs increasing in the Gulf of Maine. We're seeing declines of cod, now declines of lobsters that, as I said, we don't understand. These are not necessarily bad, but they're definitely changes. And so assuming that this ecosystem is going to be manageable back to initial conditions is probably not a fair assumption. I think we have to be thinking about how do we manage highly dynamic ecosystems. And it's not all bad. I mean, these warmer than average years, you see squid abundances increase on the coast of Maine. Squid is actually a very sustainably harvested species. So if you like calamari, the prospects might be good on the coast of Maine. I think stay curious. This is not something where you have one of these eurekas in a laboratory where you say you've figured out how things work. This is actually a process, and understanding the patterns of change, understanding what's driving those changes. We have scientific methods that can get at that. If we stick to those, I think we're going to find a robust way to sort of understand and manage and mitigate some of the problems that we've articulated. This is a field that used to only be occupied by some academics. And today, I'd say there are a lot of non-government organizations, environmental groups in the state of Maine, places like the Island Institute, Hurricane Island for Science and Leadership, Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, Gulf of Maine Research Institute. These are all places with a common interest in the future of Maine's marine ecosystems, and these are opportunities for the next generation to roll up their sleeves and help solve some of the problems that are facing us. It's the human interface that often is the biggest challenge. When I got started, I used to think, I study natural systems, and that's devoid of humans. But as it happens, humans are a big part of this ecosystem. And working with them, not talking over their head or to them, is the most productive way to go forward. And I found it to be most effective. Well, if I'm totally honest, I'd say I love to go sailing every day. And I also love scuba diving and sightseeing that way. But you have to realize that we live on a blue planet. 71% of planet Earth is ocean. And it wasn't that long ago, a century ago, when people thought this was an infinite resource that could never be affected by humans. And we certainly know otherwise now. And so I think as the ocean health goes, so goes humanity. And I think that puts it in a stage where it's very serious, where we can sort of see that there is a significant problem and roll up our sleeves and try to deal with it collectively. One of the things that has astounded me is as I worked throughout the Indo-Pacific, working up in the Aleutian Islands, working in Palau, Great Barrier Reef, Papua New Guinea, every place I went, I actually saw evidence of World War II. And I thought about how the United States was able to mobilize against a serious threat and take such decisive action in a period of 4 years. that shows what we could do. Putting a man on the moon shows what we could do. Taking that kind of resolve towards our current crisis of our global ocean is what's needed today, and I think the next generation is the ones that are going to help turn the corner on this.